Hello, everyone. Just start with a small introduction while some more people are coming in. My name is Jude Philp. I'm Senior Curator for the Mackay Collections at the Chau Chak Wing Museum. And we are, like everyone else, in lockdown at the moment. All of our exhibitions are in hibernation and other things, and we're waiting, as everyone is, on a tightrope to work out when we might be able to open and see each other again. So that's where we are currently. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation in Sydney, and it is my very great privilege to pay my respects to their ancestors, people today, and those leaders emerging in the future, and all that they have done to care for the country which we live on. Tonight, we're going to hear from Associate Professor Chris Ballard, who works at the Pacific and Asia History Department at ANU, Australian National University. Chris's work has taken him from West Papua to Papua New Guinea to Vanuatu and right across the Pacific in pursuit of histories and understandings that speak to the resources and the documents that we have from European and other explorers and from the world itself, as with Kuwae, the great volcano, to make sense of these ideas and work through differences of history and history telling. So we're meeting tonight because, in part, it's History Week here in New South Wales, which is an exciting night of different occasions. And from the ground up is the History Week theme this year. So we could think of no better potential for a talk than to hear from literally the ground up with explosions of things like the Kuwae volcano. So I'll pass over now to Chris Ballard to talk to us. Apologies, we couldn't get the closed captions to work, but if you need any clarification, just put your question in the Q&A and I can answer it. So thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you, Jude. And thank you for the kind invitation to speak to everyone this evening and to the Chau Chak Wing Museum for this opportunity. So I'm a recovering archaeologist and an erstwhile anthropologist and currently a historian. And I think you need those different skills working in the Pacific to engage with communities and to match or marry the different kinds of evidence that come to us from oral traditions, from documentary sources, from the hard sciences, to write the kinds of joined together histories that I think the Pacific deserves. So I'd like to talk to you about Kuwae and perhaps a few other volcanoes this evening. I'll start off with an acknowledgement of country, and first and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri communities on whose unceded land I'm speaking to you from, and pay my respects to their elders and leaders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to give a shout out to members of the villages of Lelepa and Mangaliliu in central Vanuatu, with whom I've worked for over 20 years now, as well as the communities and the chiefly councils more broadly across Efate and the Shepherd Islands, and especially on Tongoa, which is the island that I'll be speaking about mostly this evening. And I would like to acknowledge as well the support throughout this of three key institutions in Vanuatu: the Cultural Centre, the Vanuatu National Library, and the Vanuatu National Archives. They're astonishing institutions. It would be impossible to research in Vanuatu either without the permission of these communities or the support of these institutions. So we're all, I think, familiar with the idea of the Ring of Fire. There's a map on the left of Holocene eruptions and selected volcanoes running in a more or less circular ring around the rim of the Pacific, and down to Vanuatu and New Zealand. And most of these volcanoes lie at these plates of convergence or divergence, plate margins. And what we're looking at is some of the larger eruptions that have happened along these margins. So size does matter with volcanic eruptions. And we're going to be talking about some of the largest eruptions in our region. So eruptions that are characterized by volcano explosivity index ratings of either 6 or 7. So this is a logarithmic scale. It goes up and leaps and bounds by a factor of 10. So 2 is 10 times larger than a 1, and so on all the way up. So VEI 6 eruptions are really substantial. VEI 7, well, we've only seen 3 of those in the last 2,000 years, certainly in our region. And VEI 8 eruptions are exceedingly rare. There's really only been 1 during the period of Homo sapiens on Earth. And there's just a nice visual that gives you a kind of a graphic sense of the differences in scale of these eruptions of different magnitudes. So the VEI 7s, Long Valley Caldera down there at the bottom right in green, the really massive VEI 8s behind it of Toba and Wawa Springs. And then some eruptions you might have heard of, Krakatau or Krakatoa, a smaller eruption of VEI 6 in the center, and Vesuvius at the top left. So those are the kind of differences in magnitude that we're going to be looking at. And I should also issue a service announcement, which is that I am not now, nor have I ever been, a card-carrying member of any geological or volcanological association. So you can ask away about Strombolian eruptions, but you may not get the answers that you want. So the eruptions that I want to look at this evening are all from the Asia-Pacific region. And I'll briefly talk about these other eruptions before turning to talk about Kuwae, which is perhaps less well known than the others. So there are 2 VEI 6 eruptions, Krakatau and Long Island in Papua New Guinea, and Pinatubo, which many of us may remember from the Philippines in 1991, is one of the larger eruptions, the second largest eruption of the 20th century. But once you move up a scale to the eruptions that are 10 times larger than Krakatau, you're looking at just 3, Tambora in Indonesia, Kuwae in Vanuatu, and Samalas also in Indonesia. And I won't be talking about the mega eruption of Toba at 74,000 years ago. That's the VEI 8 one. So let's look at some of these other eruptions. Krakatau in 1883, everyone's heard of. They may have heard of it as Krakatoa. It wasn't one of the largest eruptions. It was a VEI 6 in scale. There were some earthquakes that happened prior to the eruption, and a whole bunch of tourists went out by boat to visit the volcano. And that was then followed by 2 days of massive eruption. The explosions were heard almost 5,000 kilometers away across the Indian Ocean. 20 cubic kilometers of material was ejected into the atmosphere. Most of the people killed were not killed by the eruption itself. They were killed by the tsunami that followed as the slopes of the volcano collapsed, and people at the south coast of Sumatra and the west coast of Java were struck by those tsunamis. The reason we know about this eruption is because it happened to coincide with the establishment of a global telegraph cable network. And so it was really the world's first global media event, and people were joined together by this sense, rather like 9/11 or JFK, that they had been present and been part of a kind of global community around this experience. It's also well known because the British Royal Society set out to piece together every possible source of information on the eruption and has kept doing that ever since. So it's become this laboratory for volcanic eruptions. It had global impacts, and I illustrate just one of them here, which was the spectacular sunrises and sunsets experienced in the Northern Hemisphere. These are William Ashcroft's watercolors from 1883, as the volcanic particles, the fine dust particles in the atmosphere refracted the light of sunsets and sunrises. So prior to that, we had Tambora in 1815. So a VEI 7 eruption, 10 times larger than Krakatau, killed 71,000 people on the islands of Sumbawa and Lombok, and completely destroyed the westernmost Papuan language of Tambora. So these were languages that had come out of New Guinea and were being spoken all the way along that Nusa Tenggara Timur chain but all of the speakers of that language were basically wiped out by this eruption. The following year was known in North America and Europe as the year without summer. There was pretty much no sunlight and 130 days of rain in 6 months in Switzerland. Harvests failed. And even the next 2 years, the harvests were still poor. There was still enough of that dust veil in the atmosphere to depress global temperatures and reduce the amount of sunlight getting through for crops. So we've got mortality figures. We know that 4%, there was a 4% increase in mortality in France, 6% in Prussia, and an astonishing 20% in Switzerland and Tuscany during that period, 1816 to 1817. One of the kind of side effects of Tambora, if you like, although people were unaware of the connection between this distant eruption and what was happening in Europe, was that Mary Shelley and Lord Byron and Percy Shelley, who had gone off to summer in Geneva, ended up having the most miserable possible summer and wrote, in Byron's case, the poem Darkness, and in Mary Shelley's case, the novel Frankenstein. And as we go back in time, we hit the largest eruption of the last 2,000 years, Samalas in Lombok. So this stunning crater lake at the top of Lombok, just to the east of Bali. And this was a massive event, and yet astonishingly was unknown, as it were, to science until 2012. We knew there was a large eruption in 1257 or 1258. We didn't know where it was. And almost nothing is known of the local impacts, either on Lombok or Bali or Eastern Java, because people haven't even asked the question. So that's something historians are doing now, is combing back through the record and trying to detect signs of what must have been a catastrophic event. We do know that 1258 and 1259 were amongst the coldest Northern Hemisphere summers of the past millennium. And there's been some fantastic work done recently on the most sensitive economic indicator we know, which is the taxation on wine in Europe. And you can see the tax figures plummeting in 1258 and 1259 in Western Europe. Just to give you a sense of what this does to the landscape, these are the layers of tephra, volcanic ash deposited 25 kilometers away from the volcano itself. So there's a 47-meter deposit, almost 50 meters of solid ash from that one event. And as you can imagine, there wouldn't be much that would survive that kind of cataclysm. So one other example I want to talk about before turning to Kuwae, simply because it touches upon some of the approach that I've taken to the Kuwae eruption. And that's the Long Island eruption in New Guinea, off the north coast of the island of New Guinea, which occurred in about 1665. It's a VEI6 eruption, so similar in scale to Krakatau, much smaller than Samalas or Tambora. And the focus of work by a real volcanologist, Russell Blong, who's worked on this for decades, started by identifying the ash from this volcanic eruption in the highlands, where he was working with Jack Golson on the Cook archaeological site and various other locations. And it was named Tibeto for the original find site in the highlands. And he basically traced it back to Long Island and mapped it across the highlands of Papua New Guinea and various other locations. So once he'd identified Long Island, he went through this long process of looking at things like explorers' logs and sketches. And here's William Dampier's profile of Long Island in 1700 compared to its current profile. And you can see basically that the eruption must have happened before he passed in 1700. It's essentially the same profile. And so Russell has mapped the kind of distribution, if you like, of the tephras, of the ash from that eruption across the highlands. And these are the isopachs, so the boundaries of different levels of thickness as they circle out from Long Island across the highlands of Papua New Guinea. What he then did was to send out a questionnaire to local administrators and missionaries and anthropologists and anyone else who was interested. And he got 93 responses to a very detailed questionnaire saying, have you heard stories about this eruption? And pretty much within an area that matched the range of the tephra, he got stories that talked about this time of darkness. And what's interesting is that in almost all of those locations, that was the term that people used, the time of darkness, to talk about a however long period, 2, 3, 4 days, when there seemed to be no daylight. The sky was just filled with ash, which fell on the ground. And in many cases then talk about a time of plenty, as the minerals in those ashes fertilized local soils and contributed to improved plant growth. So as he collated all those different kinds of lines of evidence from the oral histories, he was able to show that oral histories are very good at describing events. And this is the only eruption that's happened in this area in the last 300 or 400 years. In fact, in the last 1,200 years. So we pretty much know it's this event. And yet you get this spread of dates estimated from the oral traditions that really don't correspond very well to what we know about the actual historical event. So in blue there, you can see the dates estimated from these oral traditions, people saying it was in the time of my grandfather or my great-grandfather, and working backwards. And almost uniformly, they underestimate the actual date. The dashed line at 1700 is Dampier's voyage. So we know that the eruption happened before that line. And in fact, we're pretty certain that it happens in about 1665. So the green lines are the radiocarbon dates. And there's lots of different lines of evidence for this. So that's just to make the point that these oral traditions are useful, but we cannot expect them to generate chronologies, absolute dates for events this far back in the past. Now, I happen to work at the very western margins of that tephra distribution from Long Island for my PhD, working with Huli speakers in the southern highlands of Papua New Guinea. And curiously, although they were a long way from the eruption, they had the most elaborate traditions about it. They called it Bingi, the time of darkness. And for them, it was this unique historical event. 12, perhaps 15 generations ago, they have very deep genealogies and very precise descriptions about what had happened last time and what you should do when it happens again. So for them, it was turned into this form of knowledge, this formal knowledge that they passed on from generation to generation, describing what happens and telling you what to do. Build houses with stronger roofs, bring everyone in, wait a certain number of days, and then send out children who were singletons, in fact, the only child of a family, to see if the light was back over the land again. And people would go into the ditches they were digging and pull out these thin layers of greenish, grey-greenish sand and say, this is it. This is the sand that fell. And sure enough, what they were pulling out was Tibeto tephra from Long Island. Now, there's a very elaborate story that builds up from that, where ritual leaders took this volcanic eruption and the kind of fertile effect that it had on the landscape and turned it into the basis of a cosmology and a whole series of ritual practices where they were trying to control and provoke another eruption to, again, replenish the earth. I won't go into that here. It's very elaborate, but amazing to see this response to a volcanic eruption amongst people who had never seen an active volcano and had no idea that this was the ashfall from a volcano. So after that rather breathless Cook's tour around the region, let's turn now to the Kuwae eruption in central Vanuatu. So here's a series of nested maps just showing you where Vanuatu is off the east coast of Australia, and the islands in the center of Efate, where if you've ever been to Port Vila, that's on the island of Efate, the capital city. And then just to the north of it, the Shepherd Islands, including Emai and Tongawa, and the island of Epi. And the volcano that we're going to be talking about is, in fact, a caldera. It's a submarine space now, it's still an active volcano that lies between the islands of Epi and Tongawa. So there's a very unusual social system in the Shepherd Islands and in the north of Efate, unusual in the context of Vanuatu, in fact, most other parts of island Melanesia outside of Fiji, and that's a chiefly title system. where you have these very strict hierarchies from senior chiefs down to junior chiefs, and a system of enthronement by senior chiefs who pass on these titles to junior chiefs. The senior chiefs retain oral traditions of holders of their titles that go back between 48 and 52 generations. Now, they're not actually always, rather like the kings of England, succession from father to son or father to daughter. It's a bit more complicated than that. So again, you wouldn't want to use these to calibrate, to try and generate a chronology for the eruption. But they go back, 48 to 52 generations to describe the canoes on which they arrived in central Vanuatu. They named the canoes, they named the people on them, and they arrived from distant lands, and we're pretty sure that was probably somewhere in Western Polynesia, Tonga or Samoa. And then they talk about this massive eruption. And the island they landed on is not with us today. It's the island called Kuwae, and it was an island that joined Epi and Tongawa and possibly Tongariki together as a single landmass. That island was destroyed by the eruption, and in its place you've got these new islands of Tongawa, Epi, Tongariki, and various other smaller islands. When did it happen? Well, in each of the chiefly genealogies that we've looked at, about 22 to 23 generations back, so not even halfway back through the sequence. And then there's a whole second wave of canoe traditions as people, the survivors of the eruption, come back from Efate and resettle Southeast Epi and the islands of Tongawa and Tongariki. So an amazing oral tradition, and that's what has drawn me to this example. I'm building on work done by many other people, including the French anthropologist Jean Guillard, who back in the 1950s traveled to every single community in central Vanuatu, mapping these title hierarchies and sort of explaining in these elaborate diagrams how, in fact, most of the senior chiefs were on Tongawa and the junior chiefs were scattered all around the other islands. And that's just an impressionistic map on the left of those title hierarchies, all kind of zeroing in on Tongawa. And on the right, just one example of a chiefly title, and then all the junior titles to the right under that senior title. So early missionaries very quickly recognized that there was something a little bit different about Tongawan history and about Tongawan interest in genealogies and in chiefly titles. And they put up these stelae, these stone or concrete monuments sometimes to individual chiefs who converted to Christianity. And respecting local tradition, they had inscribed many of these stelae with chiefly genealogies. Now, in fact, unbeknownst to the missionaries, Tongawan people had their own mnemonics, their own ways of remembering these genealogies. First of all, specialist aure, or storytellers, or historians, if you like, attached to the court of a senior chief who were trained from a very young age and simply taught all of these genealogies. And David Luders, who you can see, the tallest figure standing up on the left-hand side, a historian in Vanuatu, has worked closely with Shepherd Islanders for many years and was involved in recording from the last of the aure storytellers some of these chiefly traditions. And here we are at a particular tapu place on Tongawa, which is a ridge with a line of stones in a kind of serpentine, wiggly line across the ridge, each stone corresponding to one holder of that chiefly title. And the correct person will walk down that line, tapping the stones and calling out the name of the holder of that title. So I'd better go to move on because I'm only just started on Kuwae. So very briefly, we've got these canoe traditions that talk at great length about coming somewhere from the east and arriving in Tanna and Erromango and moving up to the island of Kuwae and settling on that. And David Luders has argued, and I think quite convincingly, that this probably triggered a kava trade, a circular trade between Kuwae and Western Polynesia, introducing kava in large quantities to Western Polynesia, but that kava trade was then disrupted by this eruption whenever it happened. So how do we know about the eruption? Well, above all, we know about it through these oral traditions. All of these chiefly oral traditions are anchored in this event because it's a watershed moment for absolutely everyone in the region. And the stories have been documented by missionaries from the 1890s and by many others since. And we've got about 70, many more than 70 now versions documented. And they basically fall into two categories of story. One that explains why the eruption happened and how it happened. And the second, which talks about the recolonization of Tongawa afterwards. So in the first one, a young man, Pai or Tombuk, is tricked into sleeping with his own mother, into committing incest. And in an act of revenge, he goes to his uncle on the volcanic island of Lopevi and gets a green lizard and buries it in the ground beneath a tree, and then bursts a series of pig bladders, and the ground shakes beneath him. When he bursts the last bladder, the volcano, which no one knew was there on Kuwae, simply blows the island apart. And if you think about it, if you had to come up with a story to explain a cataclysm on this scale, then incest is probably the transgression appropriate in scale to the eruption. And then the second set of stories talk about this, one of two survivors, a young man who seeks refuge inside an enormous standing slit drum. And when he comes out, there's nothing left. There's one old lady who's hidden in a cave on what is now the island of Tongariki. And they're rescued and taken off to the island of Makura. And he returns as an adult and takes the new title as the first new chief of Tongawa, the Matanauri Tonga. And he's renamed later on the Titongawa, if you like, the paramount chief of Tongawa. And it's cognate to the title Tui Tonga in Tonga, the king of Tonga. So still today, people talk about and know about this lizard, and they imagine it being under the sea and still causing eruptions. And so this vent, Karua, erupts periodically in the sea that's between Epi and Tongawa and sends up these little evanescent islands that are there for a few years or even less, and then disappear under the waves again. So still an active volcano. So people talk about the flight of the survivors, of the people who recognized from the initial earthquakes that something bad was about to happen and they needed to flee. And most of them fled south. If anyone fled north, we've never heard of them since. They fled to the island of Makura, the tiny fly speck in the center, but most of them went down to Efate and Muna and took refuge there. The very last canoes to leave were swamped off by a tsunami just off Emau Island. So there's quite remarkable detail around how people fled and where they fled to. And that's just an image of the island. So Tongawa in the top right and Epi, what would have been Kuwae, and they fled to Makura in the center, down to Mataso, which we are here, and then through behind us to the island of Efate. When they returned, what they found was the island of Tongawa. And you can see those cliffs facing us here. We're right above the volcano, the submarine volcano, and we're looking at the eastern rim of the caldera, this kind of horseshoe-shaped cliff line, and then the island of Tongariki on the left and Buniga in the right, which people say were also part of Kuwae, but simply large areas of land collapsed under the shock of the earthquakes and the eruption. We also think that a former settlement on what's now a reef, Cook's Reef or Bulaiwa, was swamped by the tsunami, and there's going to be some work done looking at reefs that are facing Kuwae and the reefs on other sides of the island, because all the evidence is that the reefs facing are still 500 years later show the traces of damage. So there's then this second set of stories about coming back and recolonizing the remnant islands. And what's fascinating about this is that it happens in a two-stage process. First of all, the people who live closest to Tongawa, and in Makura, speaking Namakura language, probably the language spoken on Kuwae before, resettle Tongariki and the southern part of Tongawa, so the bit that isn't completely blasted down to the rock. And then probably decades later, those who had fled further south to Efate, who had by then learnt Nakanamanga language instead, recolonized the northern part of Tongoa, so the bit that had taken longer to recover ecologically. And so you've got these two languages spoken today by essentially the same people, one the result of having been refugees for probably decades, 1 or 2 generations on Efate. And there are all kinds of other local evidence for Kuwae. There are pre-eruption settlements exposed in sea cliffs. You can walk along the sea cliffs and see pottery and hearths and artifacts exposed beneath the tephra from this eruption. There are the burials of the chiefs, the first of the chiefs who came back. There are individual family and chiefly title histories that talk about where they went to specifically on Efate, how they came back, and the names of the canoes on which they came back. And then in some precious instances, like this one on the left, actually fragments of the original canoe on which they returned and other artifacts. Even today, land disputes on Tongoa ground themselves, if I can use the pun, on the pre-Kuwae landscape. And you can get a 3-day dispute. And Maël Calondra, a French anthropologist and friend, has witnessed this, a 3-day dispute that's entirely framed around what happened to a plot of land before, during, and after the eruption, and who therefore has rights to it, and who can actually speak for and claim that piece of land. So this is not an event that's in question at all for Tongoan people or Shepherd Islanders at all. It's utterly part of history. It's part of everyday life. And as you walk around the landscape, you can see the evidence yourself. And of course, scientists working there in the post-war period very quickly picked up on this, on the fact that Tongoans themselves had names for the different layers, the tephra layers. And you can see, rather like Samalas, we're talking about, in some cases, over 10 meters or 15 meters of tephra on the southern edge of Tongoa, and the sea cliffs on the right that have these buried landscapes beneath them and settlements. And those settlements, by the way, are named and known. The settlement names are not used now, but people will walk around the landscape and say, 10 meters under me here is an old settlement called X. So there's this remarkable invisible landscape, social landscape that people are referring to. So in the 1960s, French archaeologist José Garanger, as part of the work he's doing in central Vanuatu, New Hebrides as it was then, arrives on Tonga, armed with the stories and the genealogies from Jean Guillard, who described the Kuwae stories. And he excavates with the current holder of the Titongoa Liseriki title, the grave of that first chief to come back, Matanaritonga on Tongoa, and dates it, although there'd be some question about the dating now, to 1475. So rather conveniently, 25 years or so after the date that we think the eruption happened. And the burial, the details of the burial match perfectly the oral traditions of what people expected to find when that chief and his burial were excavated. So we now think that this eruption happened in the 1450s. Known initially from local oral tradition, documented by missionaries from the 1890s, apparently confirmed by Garanger as an archaeologist in the 1960s, and then by a team of French archaeologists working in the 1990s from Oostum in Noumea. There's a little bit of circularity of confirmation. They came up with a date of 1425 in one publication, and then realized that there was evidence from the South Pole of ice cores, which had faint traces of a major volcanic eruption in 1452. And so they simply matched the two and said, this is the 1452 event. There's some question now about whether we've in fact got 2 major volcanic eruptions during the 1450s, one in 1452 and one in 1458, with perhaps the second one being the larger one. And so I'm tempted now to kind of think about 2 quite different things. One is Kuwae, the local event, and the other, in scare quotes, is the global event of Kuwae, which has become this kind of, as we'll see, juggernaut that has its own life and is debated and disputed in academic and scientific journals, but doesn't in any way influence the significance of Kuwae on the ground in Vanuatu. So it's quite possible that this is the second largest eruption of the last 2,000 years, if the 2 events are in fact the same thing. There's some growing skepticism in certain quarters about the accuracy of some of that original volcanological work in the 1990s. And so Kuwae has been described as an eruption in search of a volcano. But you can certainly see those global effects. So here are signals for what may or may not be Kuwae in 10 different Antarctic ice cores, these spikes of sulfate or electrical conductivity in the deep ice cores that people are taking out of Antarctica. And when they map these major sulfate events over the last 2,000 years, you can see there these three big red spikes, which correspond to the VEI7 events that we've talked about. So Samalas in 1257 or 1258, Tambora in 1815, and whatever we want to call Kuwae in either 1452 or 1458. So I've got a few more slides to go. I'll make my way through them. There have been arguments around regional effects of Kuwae. James Goff, seismologist, has made the case that Kuwae may be the source of a tsunami that happens in the 1450s and that is picked up. But again, we're caught in the kind of circularity of here's an event and we've got a volcano, let's just put the two together. Quite likely that that's actually a submarine volcanic eruption in the Tongoan, in the Tongan group, not at Tongoa. So there's a lot of work still to be done to match up these regional signatures. And even more ambitiously, perhaps, James Goff and Paddy Nunn have then argued that there are a whole series of events that happen in the 1450s that may or may not be linked to the Kuwae eruption. But at this point, we're starting to, in a sense, grasp at straws. We haven't actually set out the simple steps of proof that are necessary. And this is most evident when you get to the kind of global claims for Kuwae. So we know that 1453 was the coldest year of the last 900 years, lowered Earth temperatures by about 1 degree Celsius or more for a significant period. Some would argue it initiated or kicked along, made even deeper, the Little Ice Age, or LIA1, from about the 1450s to 1530. So a really significant event, whatever this global event is. And it's linked to the abandonment of post-classic Mayan civilization due to devastating drought and exceptional cold temperatures and epidemics and famine in China, and summer snow and famine and epidemics in Eastern Europe, and possibly even to, and this is a very elaborate chain of causality, which I won't go into in detail here, but to the possibility of plague, because the bounce back that you get after the dust veil may well have promoted the growth of giant gerbil populations in Kazakhstan, who we know are the wildlife reservoir for Yersinia pestis, the plague virus. And on finally to the fall of Constantinople. And this is the most romantic of all stories, so I will tell it to you briefly. Kevin Pang, an astrophysicist, has argued that Constantinople falls in 1453. Yes, because the Ottomans are there bashing away at the walls, but they're about to give up. It's their last assault on the walls. And the Christian defenders on the walls see the sky glow a brilliant yellow behind them. And they think that the Turks have got in on the other side of the city and set the city on fire. And they abandon the walls and the Turks flood in. And in fact, what they're seeing is the refracted sunset through the dust from Kuwae. Nice story. Patrick Boucheron, who is a medievalist at the Collège de France and therefore is entitled to say these kinds of things, argues that this 1452 eruption of Kuwae is a serious candidate for the most significant date in the history of the world in the 15th century. And he is one of the world's leading historians of the 15th century. It expresses perfectly the idea of our world today, a common destiny and danger for all human beings living on Earth, born of the interdependence of societies that are distant but connected. And so in a sense, that is what the project that I'm currently engaged on is trying to prove up. How do we go about moving from these very grounded local oral traditions and the volcanological and archaeological evidence and move up the food chain to the regional and the global arguments? And so I have a project with archaeologist Stuart Bedford and volcanologist, real volcanologist Shane Cronin. And it's basically divided into 3 phases. The first phase is one that we are desperately trying to get underway because COVID has prevented us from doing that for the first 2 years. So we're hoping next year to go and really work on proving up the scale and the size of the eruption. Is it really 35 cubic kilometers of material that gets blown out of the middle of Kuwae and up into the atmosphere? And can we secure the date? Can we really nail it as closely as possible to the 1450s? If we do that, then we'll move on to those regional signatures. Can we link that to the tsunamis, to the impacts on regional societies? And if we do that, can we then go to the global signatures? And that involves working with the three centers globally of documentation in the 15th century. One is in China, one is in Europe, and one is in Central America. So the three areas that are documenting things like harvests and taxation, and that are places where we might pick up the effects of this global event. And how do we use that to model the climatic effects of these really massive eruptions? What I love about this project in its full scale, if you like, the global scale, is the idea that there is an event in the Pacific. And this is 50 years before Magellan. So this is before the Europeans have entered the Pacific. Is there an event in the Pacific that is actually of global significance, where local oral traditions told by Ni Vanuatu communities have the same status as these documentary records in Europe and China and Mexico in filling out what is, in fact, a global story? And so I'd really like to pay tribute to my local colleagues and the people with whom I hope to be working for some time to come. And in particular, in the center, Abed Marias, and to his right, in order, John Tebuninga, Alice Caloran, who's president of the Women's Association for Tonga and Shepherd Islands, and really the mover and shaker behind this project, and sadly, the late Mari Shem on the far right. And I've just put up a couple of recent papers. If you want more detail, there's quite a bit more in there, and many more references that you can use to pursue some of those other leads. I don't have a nice sunset photo of Tonga, but this is one that links me back to the Macleay Museum, the former Macleay Museum at the University of Sydney, where I had a very happy fellowship working on Nikolai Maclay's work. And this is his watercolor of Vulcan Island, or Manam, in 1877. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was fantastic. I still don't get used to not hearing applause when people finish off their considerable talks like yours. But I'm sure everybody will join me in doing that. Thanking you very much for that talk. People here, if you want to ask Chris a question, can you put it into the Q&A? Because we're in a webinar format. So once I can see those questions, I can then give them to Chris. It always amazes me, and it shouldn't, because we live in Australia with its incredible Aboriginal histories, the immensity and depth of knowledge that is contained through oral traditions in their various forms. And I wondered whether you could speak a little bit about how you've talked about genealogies and about storytelling, but I wondered if you could comment at all on how songs are part of this way of knowing and being able to continue information over vast periods of time, or if it's even relevant.
No, it's absolutely relevant. And again, as I've said about oral traditions, they're not about chronology. They're not about fixing dates and time. That's not the reason why people tell these stories to each other. They are about transformations of the landscape and transformations of the social landscape. So the way that people relate to each other is completely reconfigured by an event of this scale. So it's really important for people to know about it, because it anchors things like, and helps people to resolve disputes over land or disputes over title. You have to know this history. So the communities in both Tonga and the Huli community I worked with in Papua New Guinea are a little unusual in that they really do focus. They are, if you like, obsessed with history, which is why I went to work with them. But in fact, most communities are adept at communicating this kind of information over long periods, with or without the human genealogies attached. So many other parts of Papua New Guinea remember the time of darkness, the 1665 eruption and ashfall, but they link it in time to successive settlements. And they say, when we lived in the village of X, whoever our ancestors were, that's when this happened. Okay. So I have no trouble with Indigenous Australian, First Nations Australian and Torres Strait Islander stories about events that may have happened thousands of years ago, because these are highly significant. And we know people have the capacity to communicate these kinds of events over thousands of years. It's much more difficult to prove and to be sure of exactly what events you're talking about. And if you work in an area where there are multiple eruptions happening, Alaska, for instance, how can you be sure which of the 80 or 90 large eruptions in a century people are talking about? So we're a little bit fortunate in Papua New Guinea because there's one eruption in the last 1,200 years that covers the highlands, and we're fortunate in Vanuatu because there's one eruption that blows Kuwae apart. But I think there's enormous potential for this kind of work. And I also don't think that these narratives kind of decay with time terribly much. We're getting richer stories about Kuwae now that we're asking the right questions than the missionaries got in the 1890s. They're recognizably the same stories, but if you know how to ask the right questions, people will come up with all sorts of detail that wasn't being recorded over a century ago.
Yeah, it is it is always mesmerizing to hear and be an audience to that great power to use that oration to recall and to bring everybody into those histories as they talk to people who know them, who hear them back, and then to hear.
And sorry, you did ask about songs as well. And there are songs that attach to these stories about Kuwae. And if you like, they're the proofs. So songs are easy to learn. You learn a simple set of lyrics and you can memorize a tune. And so these songs have come down attached to the stories, but in archaic forms of language that people can barely understand today. So they've been learnt and transmitted phonetically. And it's possible that what we have in some of these songs is the original language of Kuwae. But they're extremely difficult even to transcribe and very challenging to translate. So some senior figures in the Tongan community are working on that at the moment, but not easy to do.
I have a question here from Rebecca Conway, my colleague, who, and this is pertinent to the fact that not that long ago, Australia and New Guinea were joined. It's only 10,000 years, which is not that far away in terms of the kinds of big histories we're talking about. Is there any linkage that you know of in Aboriginal or Islander culture about any of these eruptions? I mean, these are relatively close events that are happening to them.
There's a recent book by Patrick Nunn that looks at exactly this question and that deals extensively with Australian evidence. As I said, it's in many cases a lot more difficult to prove because the time depth is much greater. And we are talking about events thousands of years old. So there are claims for Aboriginal memories of sea level rise 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, Aboriginal memories of megafauna. If there's one place on the planet where memories would be preserved over thousands of years, it is in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So I wouldn't seek to contest that at all. I would recognize the challenge that it's much harder to convince scientists of that than, say, this Kuwae example or the Long Island one. But no, very credible to me, very credible.
But no one that you know of has scientifically tested for evidence of Kuwae, for instance, in Australia?
Sorry. Okay, so for direct evidence of Kuwae. No, and it's quite interesting because just to the south of Kuwae on Efate, we get almost no tephra at all from that eruption. It's not visible. You can see it or detect it in swab cores from Efate. Now that probably tells us what season it happened. If it happened with the southeast trade winds in place, which is what we think, most of the tephra would have blown across Epi and out to sea. And certainly we do have meters and meters of tephra deposit from this event on Epi. So I don't think we'd have seen tephra in Australia. There has been a thesis written that argues that the climate of Eastern Australia, and of Queensland in particular, shifted dramatically in the 1450s. And they've linked that to the Kuwae eruption. So you would expect to see global impacts, and Australia would have experienced those impacts as well as the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the challenges that you may or may not get to, because it's an immense project that you're in the midst of, and you have been bound by COVID to not be able to travel. But there is that kind of learning how to see the traits which will come from your PhD work and elsewhere of the big events and the traits of history that give you a sense that, oh, this is another line to follow. This is somewhere else I can go to find that little lead.
It is. And what it engenders is a kind of a healthy skepticism in dealing with really different registers of proof. So Tongawan Islanders are not trying to prove the historicity or the date of Kuwae, although they may be now. There are different kinds of issues there which have to do with sequence. What came first, what came next, what came after that, okay? And so Kuwae is this time spike in all of those kinds of stories and claims and disputes. You have to know what happened before and after. And that's a very different question from the one that scientists are arguing. But what I love is that there's no more certainty around the scientific evidence than there is around the oral traditional evidence. They have, for me, the same kind of status. And the challenge is, how do you marry them together? How do you bring them together?
We have another question from Rachel Smith on part of that. Do you know of any narratives in Kuwae in other parts of Vanuatu, Western Pacific, similar to the time of darkness, that points to wider regional interests, impacts?
Yeah, we don't, and it would be hard even to know where to go. Okay, so we have an unusual conjunction in Kuwae of people who were already interested in history and already documenting long genealogies for chiefly titles, being struck by a cataclysm that then sets up a whole new series of competition between chiefly titles and another reason to keep telling those stories. If you don't know, rather like the Huli, what's causing, a few days of darkness or a light fall of ash, and if it doesn't transform social relationships or the landscape, there's not much reason to tell that story. A tsunami that happened 50 years ago will be much more consequential and may even kind of efface previous events. So I'd be very surprised if we found stories about Kuwae from anywhere else at all. We have no stories about Kuwae from Epi, from the western part of the island, because I think everybody there was basically killed. And the people who recolonized Epi, probably from the island of Malakula, have their own kinds of stories to tell, different interests. Yeah. Yeah,
amazing. Well, I know that you've had a really long day, Chris, today. For those of you who don't been involved in an 8-hour student session via Zoom. So if there aren't any more burning questions, thank you again, Chris. That it's an amazing talk for History Week, particularly because it does bring in the need to work as a historian through varieties of forms of knowledge and to use all of these different ways of learning about the past to think about our time now and to understand people in general. It's been really fantastic. Thank you again. I'm sure everybody else will join me in clapping and wish you a very good evening. You had a parting word.
Thank you, Jude. Well, just to say, thanks again for the opportunity, and my email address was in the title slide. I'm always happy to hear from people who've got queries or ideas of their own. It's very much a public kind of history, this, so do please get in touch.
Well, that's really generous of you, Chris. Thank you very much. I'll pass over now to Craig Barker just for some information about future talks, and thanks again everyone for coming. Yeah, great talk.
Thank you, Jude. I too would just like to add my voice to say thank you very much, Christopher. That was a fascinating talk. I learned a lot, and I appreciate your time. For everyone, pardon me, for everyone who's joined us this evening, just to say that whilst we're in lockdown, the Chau Chak Wing Museum is endeavouring to present a variety of talks via Zoom, covering a wide range of topics to reflect our collections. And until we can safely welcome you back into the museum again. So just a very quick advert to say that on the 15th of September next week, the Chau Chak Wing Museum is very, very honoured to be a co-sponsor along with the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney of the annual St. Lee Lecture. This year it's John Guy, who is the curator of Southeast Asian art and South Asian art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, talking on China in India. On the 23rd and again on the 25th of September, we have our first ever online Zoom creative drawing classes with Peter Larson from the Sydney College of the Arts. Very, very limited numbers for these two events, but I know these are going to be fun, so book early if you're interested. And then to say that on Thursday, the 30th of September, we're very, very pleased to host our friends, the Partial Historians, the highly acclaimed podcast series on Roman history presented by Dr. Fiona Radford and Dr. Peter Greenfield. We'll be recording a live episode of their podcast titled Why Yes, I Did Murder the King, the Women of Early Rome. So that will be a lot of fun. And that event is co-sponsored with our good friends and colleagues at the Australasian Women in Ancient World Studies. We're currently working now for a whole series of events in October online as well. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or this evening. Thank you again to Christopher, and have a lovely and safe evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.